Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Gabrielle Ludwig. I'm Director for Sustainability and Environmental Affairs at the Almond Board of California, and been around the Almond Board now for some 16 years, so many of you have seen me up here on the days over the years at various conferences. Today we wanted to talk a bit about carbon markets or ecosystem services markets as something, I'll call it a small potential additional income stream as a potential. But today we just wanted to give you some background on what the carbon markets are, what they are, how they exist, and so forth. So in terms of the speakers we have today, we have Debbie Reed, who is Executive Director from Ecosystem Services Market Consortium. We have Chris Adamo, who works on sustainability issues with Danone in North America. And I say Danone, I'm never quite sure because I've got some European background in me. So, and then Jack Jaworski is Director of Business Development for Ecosystem Services Market Consortium. I'll just let you know, we actually looked for someone else other than two people from ESMC. But when we asked around, everybody said Debbie is the person who knows about carbon markets, period, whether her own version or other versions. So that's why we have two people from ESMC. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Debbie to give you background on carbon markets in general, and then Chris will talk about what the perspective is from a CPG company or a food company, and Jack will talk a little bit more specifically about, we're actually doing a pilot in Almonds, and so he'll talk a bit about that. So.
Great, thank you, Gabrielle. And hi, Chris, nice to see you there momentarily. So I'm going to talk about carbon markets from a very high level, and I will start by saying they are very messy right now. There's a lot going on in carbon markets, and even though carbon markets per se started 25 years ago when I started working in them, there has been a lot of changes recently within the past 2 or 3 years that is making the space really messy. I will try to just simplify it to the things that I think are relevant, including why they started, and if there's anything you pay attention to, it is who is buying and why. If you're an almond buyer and you want to enter a market, you will have roles and responsibilities. Right now, there's a lot of different roles and responsibilities, rules, standards that people are either following or not following, and you just need to ask a lot of questions. So that is what I hope to convey. So I'll cover the carbon market basis. I'll talk about compliance carbon markets and voluntary carbon markets. And within voluntary carbon markets, there are some new instruments that I think are going to be the greatest source of demand in the future. We are already seeing huge demand, so I will spend a little time talking about them. Talk about the sudden growth in carbon markets and why we are seeing the huge spike in growth and demand in carbon markets, including demand for agricultural credits in those markets. And then talk a little bit about carbon markets in the US, just kind of some trends that we're seeing at the state level as opposed to the federal level. And then go through some questions that I think almond growers need to know if you're thinking about participating in these markets. You don't really need to read these eye charts. Sometimes you can go back and look at a PowerPoint, but I'll say why did carbon markets start? And it's important to understand this. In the 1990s, 1992, explicitly, 192 countries got together under a UN convention and all agreed to reduce their greenhouse gas footprint every year from that year forward. So every one of those countries did a greenhouse gas inventory and looked at their direct and their indirect emissions, came up with plans to how to reduce them, have been trying to do that for years, have largely been unsuccessful for whatever reason, whether it's political reasons, financial, monetary, political will, have largely been unsuccessful. We have seen some countries where they've been successful, and we have seen emissions at least stabilizing, if not going down for the most part, but emissions have continued to go up since then. Carbon markets were created as a result of that, and I will describe why. So what all the countries did is they said, what are the highest emitting sectors in our countries? It turned out it was energy, transportation, buildings, and manufacturing. So they all focused on that. And then they figured out very quickly, all of those industries, the highest emitting industries, have very long capital turnover. Think of how long a power plant lasts, 50 years. So you can't just shut down a power plant that you just built, right? So they all decided, well, we need to look for, in the early years, lower cost sources of emission reductions. Those all came from the other industries that were not as intensive. Agriculture, forestry were of interest, and there were some credits that have been generated from ag and forestry over the years, but there were other sectors that provided those credits. And so the markets evolved so that if a country could not reduce their transportation emissions, for instance, immediately, they could purchase credits from another sector to kind of alleviate that. So that's how the markets evolved, right? So it was so that if you have a capital-intensive turnover sector that will take years to reduce their emissions, buy emissions from somewhere else to make up for it for a while. The intent was that 25 years ago, these offset markets would last for 20 years, because by then we would start to see true emissions coming from these other sectors. But that's not really ever happened. We are only now starting to see carbon markets in most regions of the world starting to take hold. And it's because private sector corporations have now done what those countries did back in the 90s. They've all started looking at their greenhouse gas footprint, their direct and their indirect emissions, and they are spending millions and billions of dollars trying to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. It's because of consumer pressure, shareholder pressure, stakeholder pressure, and increasingly, the Securities and Exchange Commission is now looking at the reports that all these companies are filing to make claims about how their emissions reductions are being accomplished. So there's a lot happening here. That is why you're seeing the sudden growth. Those are the buyers you should keep your eyes on. It's the private sector, and in particular for agriculture, the food and beverage sector. What is a carbon credit? A carbon credit anywhere in the world is the same. It is 1 ton of greenhouse gas emissions reduced or sequestered. So 1 ton, that's really all you need to know about a credit. This is another important point. Traditionally in carbon markets, we have carbon offset credits. We now have a new instrument as carbon inset credits, and that is the one that the private sector and the food and beverage sector in particular are interested in for agriculture. So I'll describe offset. They serve a different purpose, and they have very different rules for how you account and report for these emission reductions that come from them. And one is tradable, one is not. So carbon offset credits, they are tradable credits. There's a global carbon market. You can trade credits anywhere in that market in terms of carbon offset credits. They can cross sectoral boundaries. So you see a lot of instances of the energy sector purchasing credits from the agriculture sector or the forestry sector to offset their emissions. So they're tradable. They can also cross country boundaries, state boundaries, other boundaries. So you can purchase a credit from Costa Rica to offset your emissions in Germany. That is how offset markets work. There are secondary, tertiary markets for carbon offset credits. They're tradable. You can trade them, you can bank them, you can use them later. They don't have to be used in any given time frame. Carbon offset credits, or carbon inset credits, are very, very different. Brand new instrument, they're not always called this, they're called supply chain emission reduction units, supply chain emission reduction impacts. They account for emission reductions within a company's supply chain, not their direct footprint, which is where you use carbon offsets. Carbon insets. They account for absolute emission reductions. They don't allow a ton of carbon for each credit to be emitted elsewhere. They're absolute. So that's a huge difference between insets and offsets. Also, they are not tradable assets. They have to be generated and filed on an annual basis by companies. So you can't bank them, you can't trade them. They are also not tradable across sectors or borders. So the food and beverage sector, if they're looking to reduce their agricultural supply chain footprint, can buy offsets or insets from within their agricultural supply chain. The energy sector cannot purchase carbon insets from the agricultural sector. The energy sector has to purchase insets from within their sector. So that's a big difference as well. And they also don't cross country borders. There are what I will call supply sheds that govern where they can come from. We don't need to know that. Just the details, though, not tradable, have to be used every year. This is where there's huge demand, increasing participation in voluntary markets right now, particularly from the private sector. How do markets work? I won't go into this other than to say typical markets. You have supply and you have demand. Right now, demand is outstripping supply in every sector. So we're starting to see prices going up. We're starting to see more market activity. We don't yet have liquidity in these markets, but we are starting to see more activity in them. There are two types of carbon markets in California. You will be familiar with compliance carbon markets because in California we have a cap and trade program that is a compliance market. What a compliance market is, it's regulated by a government. There are examples on the screen. The EU is probably one of the first. It has an EU emissions trading scheme that covers multiple countries within Europe that are obligated to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and they do allow trading. China has just started setting up a national emissions trading scheme on a provincial approach. Not all provinces have theirs, but they're starting to all come online. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, is a consortium of 11 states in the Northeast that trade amongst themselves. And then, of course, California Cap and Trade. Compliance markets only trade offsets. They do not trade insets. Insets cannot be used as an instrument within compliance markets, at least now. That might change in the future, but that's the way it is now. As I indicated before, they are tradable. They can cross sectors. They can cross countries. That has created a problem, and I'll outline the problem. In 2015, all the world scientists said we no longer can concentrate on energy, transportation, municipal, or manufacturing and building as the high-emitting sectors. Every single sector needs to start reducing their emission reductions. But because offsets allow emissions reductions to trade sectors, if the ag sector generates an offset credit, sells it into the energy sector, that now counts against an emission reduction in the energy sector, not in the agricultural sector. So we have created mechanisms that are creating what I call attribution or allocation issues. That will correct itself, I think, in the next 5 to 10 years in the markets. I'm not quite sure how, but it has created issues of attribution. And boundary issues, right? If a credit is sold from one country to another, it's then counted in a different country, and then the country has to account for that. The other type of carbon market, different than compliance market, is voluntary carbon markets. These are actually the most active. These are global in nature. They're not government regulated. There are no government boundary restrictions. They do have rules, they do have standards, but they are not governed by countries. The greatest use traditionally has been by the private sectors, including in some cases a private sector that has a compliance obligation and is allowed to purchase from the voluntary market, but that differs by markets. The voluntary markets are where you are seeing these new insetting or supply chain emission reduction units being traded and sold. That's just starting to happen, but again, you will see a lot more of that in the future. And again, they're not tradable, and they stay within the sector, and they stay within a certain boundary. So there's the rules and standards for insets are still being created, but companies have to comply with the existing rules, which are not always clear right now. So there's a lot of messiness happening, in particular there. But there is a lot of demand, and it will continue well into the future. Why the sudden growth in carbon markets? If you paid attention at all to COP26 in Glasgow, which was the 26th conference of those parties, I talked about 192 countries in 1992 signing on. That was the first COP. The 26th COP, or the Conference of the Parties, happened in Glasgow this year. It has been dubbed the business COP. So the COP is literally countries getting together and talking about how well they're doing. It's been dubbed the business COP because there was much more activity, much more commitments, much more investments by the private sector happening at that COP. So again, it just shows the trends. This is where buyers are coming from. This is where your buyers of the future will continue to come from. The Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets has indicated that to achieve all of the commitments we have seen by countries and companies, we have to increase market activity 15-fold by 2050 And they have estimated those markets will be $100 billion markets by 2050. And again, we're starting to see that activity go up. In the food and beverage sector, and the interest in agricultural credits, again, coming from the food and beverage sector in particular, it is not uncommon for a company like Pepsi to have 90% or more of their total greenhouse gas emissions coming from their indirect emissions, including in agriculture. I use Pepsi because 93% of their greenhouse gas footprint comes from the agricultural commodities that they purchase and consume to generate their credit. So 93% of what they are doing, their investments are in agriculture. That is not uncommon in companies in the food and beverage sector. It differs, and Chris will talk to you about Danone's and what Danone is doing. That is where you, as almond growers, will see a lot of activity in the future. Food and beverage companies who purchase your products. And some of you probably already hearing from those purchasers saying, I have a commitment to reduce my greenhouse gas emissions. I want to work with you to reduce yours so that we can both achieve these goals. And they are participating in markets to actually help do that. Net zero, I will just say this because it is the big term now. It was the big term in Glasgow and COP26. What net zero means is for every country and every company reducing their emissions to the point that they are literally neutral and not creating any additional emissions. So whether they're purchasing credits or reducing their emissions through changing their light bulbs, reducing their greenhouse gas emissions from their agricultural sector, it really comes down to when the carbon going into the atmosphere is equal to the carbon or removals coming from the atmosphere. Every company in every country has created a pathway to do this and to achieve this net zero, because that is what scientists are saying we need to do to prevent further anthropogenic problems like floods, droughts, wildfires that we are experiencing here in this state. In the 2015 Paris Agreement, all countries committed to that, and again, we're starting to see corporations do this. And personally, I've never seen the financial analysis of this, but I think companies are actually investing a lot more than what we have seen countries and governments invest in achieving this. And I think that's why that demand signal in the markets is suddenly so high. And again, carbon markets are one way that companies can help to meet their emissions. Carbon markets in the US, we have both compliance and voluntary carbon markets. There are many new programs that are popping up around the country, and I will say we are asked all the time, what is the difference between them? I can't tell you. Like, I can't keep up with it, and it would take me a lot of time to really analyze all of these programs. At the end, when I talk about what almond growers should look for, those are some of the questions you should be asking. I haven't seen a good, independent, neutral analysis of all of these programs. So hopefully by asking the right questions, you can do a little bit of investigation yourself. I will say that there are some new programs that are not traditional and that don't meet the requirements and standards that companies have to report, and that is what you need to know, right? Because if that's the case, you are not going to have long-term buyers in a market that does not meet the standards. The companies, I referenced the SEC, do in fact have to follow rules and standards of how they account and report for their emission reductions. This slide is a terrible slide, but I will just say that we are starting to see more state activity in terms of statutory greenhouse gas reduction and reporting requirements. The states in orange, California, of course, was one of the first, have statutory reduction and reporting requirements. Some states, the different colors, account for states that have reduction requirements, but no reporting requirements, reporting requirements, but no reduction requirements. The states in gray that you can't see on this slide actually have neither, but again, these are going to start to increase. We're starting to see much more activity at the state level, and you've probably been hearing about activity at the federal level as well. This is states with market-based policies that may or may not be linked to the reporting and reduction requirements. You see those 11 states in the Northeast, California, of course. Virginia and Pennsylvania have an interesting one that is related to transportation, trading credits just within the transportation sector. Again, I think we're going to start to see a lot more activity at the state level here. So now let's get into the final part. What do almond growers need to know One thing that I will bring up, I'm asked this every single time I talk, what about early adopters and growers who have done something? Markets pay for new product. Markets will not pay for early adopters or something you did last year. We can talk about where those, that sort of policy should come from, but that's not what markets do. If you are offered to get paid in a market by somebody who says you don't have to do anything if you've been doing no-till or cover crops for 20 years, we can pay you, I would ask who's buying and why, right? Because corporates can't make claims on something that is not new in a product, in a market. I would also say before you sign up for a program, get clarity on what the program requirements are for you as a grower. What are the rules and roles and responsibilities you will play? What are the timelines? Are they transparent about pricing? How the credits will be priced? How much this program will take, right? How will they find buyers? Do they have buyers already aligned? Just ask a lot of questions. Because again, I have not found a good, independent, transparent source to really compare the many programs that are out there. Before rolling, ask about roles and responsibilities, eligibility requirements. What are the system changes? Some programs say these are the only changes in practices or systems that you can implement. Some programs say there's a whole suite, you can pick 1, 3, 5, or 10, right? You should know that up front. And do you have to enroll your entire orchard, or can you enroll part of it and build that over time and kind of test the system, if you will? Also, the markets, I referred to standards, and I won't go through all of the players in this, but is the program validated? Like, does it follow any standards? Which standards? Are the protocols approved by the registries and the organizations that kind of govern the rules and requirements in these markets, right? And then I referenced this already, but ask about pricing and cost centers, and will pricing go up? How much of a cut is the organization taking? There are middlemen in these markets, and sometimes that term is used in a negative way and given a negative connotation. I will say there are true cost centers to organizations who run these markets and make the opportunity available to growers, right? So I want to go through them. But again, there are real costs involved. They include protocol development, project development, and implementation, right? Someone has to do this and do it in a way that you are assured that you will get paid for a valid credit at the end of your participation in a market. MRV, which is monitoring, reporting, and quantification. You actually do have to monitor, verify, and report emissions according to standards. If that's not done correctly, you will not get the credits that are coming to you. So you want to know who's paying for that and how much that will cost. If ongoing monitoring is required, and right now the standards are requiring or considering requiring ongoing monitoring for increased soil organic carbon, who's going to pay for that? That's actually expensive, depending on how you do it. We have new tools and technologies that can do it at lower cost, but they're mostly in development, remote sensing, satellite imagery, et cetera. Those are true costs. Producer enrollment, this is perhaps the biggest thing. If you get good on-the-ground conservation technical assistance, you can maximize your participation in a market and maximize what you will get paid. You need to understand up front, how do I maximize my participation in this according to the rules of the program that you're participating in? Good conservation technical assistance can really help you with that up front so that it is a good opportunity for you to maximize financial assistance. I guess that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. That was a lot of information.
Yes.
That's where you see 25 years experience showing up. To Jack, and he's going to talk about an almond project.
Thank you, Gabrielle, and thank you, Debbie and Chris. Now I want to talk to you about bringing carbon markets kind of back to the ground from the producer perspective. You've heard about global markets, you've heard about buyer motivations, and now I want to talk about what's in it for producers. The good news is producers and almond growers don't need to know all the details about global carbon markets or buyer demand to be successful in them. Let me get started here. Okay, it's the title slide. A little bit of what I'm going to talk to you about today. I'm going to talk to you about ESMC, that's the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium. That's the organization Debbie and I work for. I'm going to briefly overview the motivations of the buyers, and then I'm also going to talk about what's in carbon and ecosystem markets for almond growers. ESMC's mission is to incentivize farmers and ranchers to improve soil health and scale beneficial environmental outcomes. In other words, we succeed when growers get paid for generating ecosystem benefits. Now, how is ESMC different than private carbon markets? For one, we're a nonprofit. We're mission and impact oriented. As a nonprofit organization that creates partnerships between the private and public sectors, ESMC is mission and impact oriented. ESMC's robust, science-based program offers the best value to producers. We are not profit-driven and not seeking to recoup our investments in market development. We also have innovative methods to stack credits, so that's soil carbon, net greenhouse gas, water quality, and water quantity. By doing that, that means that producers get the most return on investment per acre. So that's a portfolio of products that you're producing from your fields and orchards. ESMC's focus on ag supply chain emission reporting also differentiates our program. Food and beverage companies are investing massive amounts of money into lowering their supply chain emissions. Our buyer members include General Mills, Nestle, PepsiCo, Danone, Tyson, Mars, McDonald's, Cargill, John Deere, and many more. That's where the demand for these markets comes from. Lastly, ESMC allows for agriculture and the agricultural value chain to co-invest in ESMC's market program to reduce cost and scale impact. Those companies all invest in ESMC to help build out a program that works for agriculture. Now, I don't expect you to see all of these logos right now, but I wanted to give you a sense of kind of the scale of our market program, the players involved, and you'll see that ESMC has over 80 members across the agricultural value chain, and that includes many food and beverage companies, including some I already mentioned, agribusinesses, farmer-led associations, farmer checkoffs and cooperatives, conservation NGOs, and land-grant universities. It's true when I say that ESMC is a historically unprecedented alignment of the entire agricultural value chain. It's really unique what we're doing. Now, I think this has been covered already pretty thoroughly about what credit attributes buyers are looking for. So for the sake of time, I'm actually going to skip this slide. So a little bit about how our market program works. First, a grower implements a practice change. And so that could be planting cover crops for the sake of almond growers, applying compost, whole orchard recycling, and soon we want to offer for almond growers water conservation credits that happen through water conservation practices and other practice changes. A producer enrolls in ESMC's program, and that's a pretty simple user interface that gathers some data about your fields. Next, ESMC works with partners for soil sampling on site. Our partners really do all the heavy lifting there, so there's not too much for growers to worry about other than kind of figuring out when those soil samplers can visit. Next, ESMC quantifies the credits, verifies the credits, and generates the credits through our MRV platform. That's Measurement, Reporting, and Verification Platform. Basically, ESMC does all the work to turn that data that's collected from your operation into saleable credits that buyers can purchase. We then sell those credits to our buyers and pay producers. Here I have a map of ESMC pilot project locations. You'll see we have circled California, in particular the Central Valley, where we are doing an almond pilot now, which is what I'm here to speak to you about. But you'll see we have a lot of activity. In fact, ESMC is currently operational in 75% of the United States, with a lot of activity in the soy and corn belt, but you'll see that we have coverage all over. We are developing protocols so that we can scale in all these regions as we calibrate and validate our models, basically so producers don't have to worry about that work. So some more information about our current pilot in the Central Valley. We currently have a valuable partnership with the Almond Board of California, and we have been working together to develop an ecosystem services pilot project specifically designed to benefit almond growers. So the vision is as follows. The project will sequester soil carbon, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and improve water quality and water conservation in almond production systems in California's Central Valley. This pilot gives almond growers an opportunity to enter at the ground floor. ESMC's market program is currently in a pilot phase, so early participants in this pilot project will have a unique opportunity to test new innovations and provide input to ESMC to guide program development. We approach producer experience humbly and really value your input. Carbon and ecosystem markets only work if they work for producers. I'd further add that the opportunity that this pilot project presents is low risk. The pilot phase will also provide flexibility and less risk for producers who will have an opportunity to roll into the full market program when it is launched at the end of 2022. There is significant opportunity in ESMC's market program for almond growers. Growers can monetize greenhouse gas removals that occur with increased soil organic carbon, which happens after planting cover crops. Growers can also profit from greenhouse gas reductions with a focus on nitrous oxide, with additional opportunity for reducing carbon dioxide and methane. The market rate for these greenhouse gas credits is projected to skyrocket in the near future as demand increases, allowing participants in the pilot project to benefit from that increase in carbon credit prices. So who's eligible? Almond producers in the Central Valley who adopt or carry out one or more of the following management practices in their almond production system in or beyond fall 2021 for a 2022 pilot project will be eligible. So some of those practice changes, and as Debbie mentioned, there has to be a practice change because that's what buyers need to pay for, a new product. Some of those practice changes could be planting cover crops. For example, growers can grow commercial mixes during winter rains or within or between crops. Also, growers can apply compost, such as green waste or manures. Third, there's whole orchard recycling, such as chipping trees and spreading these chips out or incorporating them into the soil. ESMC is working on helping growers to also profit from water usage reduction, water quality improvements, and biodiversity and pollinator potential. This is ESMC's stacked credit approach, maximizing grower return investment per acre. Some additional requirements that I think are important for almond growers to know. Producers will need to implement new practices or improvements on their land that exceed minimum standards set by law. They also need to provide proof of land ownership and right to sell credits or an agreement with the landowner to the same effect. Producers will also need to not enroll the same lands during the same time in another ecosystem service or market program, and that hopefully makes sense. We have to make sure that producers aren't paid twice for the same environmental outcome and that those credits are unique. Some more specifics about this pilot that we're pretty excited about. Producers have a low hurdle to enroll and opportunities to grow with the program. The pilot begins with a one-year contract so producers can see if entering the carbon and ecosystem market space is right for them. After this period, if you wish to proceed, you can sign a 5-year contract and be first in line to generate revenue from these markets in the Central Valley. Producers do not have to pay to participate or to purchase inputs or subscriptions to participate. That's another benefit to ESMC's nonprofit structure. We have no hidden agendas or business models that bias us in ways that go against producer interests. Unlike private market programs, which have thus far largely neglected California's compliance market, we measure our success by how much value we return to producers. I'd also add that producers own their data and credits in ESMC's program. ESMC puts a premium on producer privacy and will never sell your data to a third party. There are no minimum or maximum acreage limits or number of fields required at this time. Producers can phase in more acres and/or practices over time as they see fit, and producers have autonomy to decide which practice changes are best suited for their operation. However, you will be provided information on recommended practices and other helpful resources to maximize the environmental impacts that your operations can generate and ultimately your payments through our program, while also increasing your bottom line. For interested producers who may want to enroll in the pilot, we have Gabrielle's email here, who you can contact directly to learn more. And we also have here a link. That's actually a non-active enrollment link. That's okay. But if you just search ESMC on our website, there are a host of very helpful, frequently asked questions targeted specifically to growers. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Jack, for introducing the Almond ESMC pilot project. And I just want to say, really, the way I view this is building on, since I see some of our researchers here, the Almond board has been funding research on trying to figure out what are some of these soil health practices that actually work for the almond system. And we've been working on nitrogen management and so forth. And to me, this is really saying, okay, how can we further leverage that data into a program like this? So I just want to say this really is building on the research that you guys have funded over the years to try and see if we can get some additional dollars into your hands for actually doing these things. So with that, I'm going to open up the floor to questions. And there are mics up here. Please do come up, or I will repeat the question. Yes?
I don't know that I need a mic. Do you have a good resource on cover crop or compost and how much you have to lay down or plant to get a recognized ton of greenhouse gas? And is there a rule of thumb you use for your basic economics, right? Like if it's, quarter ton an acre or whatever, something like that?
Do either of you want to try and answer that first?
No, I'm afraid, is this working? Yeah, I'm not qualified to answer that question, let's put it that way. I'm sure somebody can, and I'm not sure if Gabrielle can, but.
Well, I would say part of the reason why there's so much emphasis on actually monitoring what happens in the soil is because there's quite a bit of variability. Sure. Okay? So we have resources in terms of how to, like we've just released a how-to cover crop guide for almonds because it's complicated, it's not as simple. And we have a how-to for whole orchard recycling. For whole orchard recycling, I think the other data source that I would use, and I'd have to look into this, is, CDFA also has incentive programs like the Healthy Soils Initiative, and because some of those dollars come from the cap and trade funds, they have to show there's greenhouse gas reductions. So they have some data behind and what estimates they are. But the CDFA, California Department of Food and Agriculture, because they have to, as part of their Healthy Soils program, they have to show to the Air Resources Board there's a greenhouse gas sequestration or reduction. So there are some numbers, but, and then again, I have Emily and Brent in the audience if they want to add anything to that. But fundamentally, that's part of the reason why all these systems are currently relying on actually monitoring those changes in the soils, because, different irrigation practices, different amounts of organic matter put in, different soil types, when the rains fell, all affect the kind of organic matter you get over time.
I'm with you, but people need a like, do I even want to get into this? So what do they use as a rule of thumb?
As a rule of,
It takes this many acres to do this, and it's
Right.
$5 a credit or whatever.
Right.
I don't know what the numbers are. I'm just trying to figure out what the rules of thumb are. I get that it's complicated.
yeah. Trying to remember, I think there's some estimate of roughly half, sort of just as a rough estimate to get you started, assume half a ton
Ton of carbon
per acre
per year.
if you're doing one of these annual inputs, okay? That's sort of a rule of thumb, and then you can look at the carbon prices, which,
We're paying $15 a ton right now, so
Right.
$7.50 per acre.
15. Okay, so that's why I'm saying this is not the big bucks right now, but it's a start, okay?
And the cost of a carbon credit is projected to rise to about $30 or $40 in the near future. And we anticipate that happening probably within a decade or less.
Up and down, it's like stoplight.
Any other questions? Brent?
Is the carbon credit received going to be linked to the change in carbon in the soil? That you have to monitor?
Let me just repeat the question, because I'm not, the question was, will the carbon credit received be linked to the change in carbon in the soil?
Yeah, there's two types of credits. One is called a removal. That quantifies increases in soil carbon. And there's also greenhouse gas reduction. So for instance, if nitrous oxide is reduced, that's a different, it's counted differently, but you can stack them basically. Some projects only focus on removals and soil carbon. To be accurate, you have to focus on all of the above, because you could see soil carbon going up and nitrous oxide going up and no net impact. So we actually track and report all of the above.
But I guess the question really is, at the end of the day, what does the grower get paid on? You know, that's, because that's a really fundamental question.
Yep, if it's, you'll get paid for both the removals and the reductions, but it should be the net, right? So if you have some removals and some reductions, you can add them. Again, some programs just look at removals and not reductions. So that's one of the questions you ask. Will I get paid for both removals and reductions? And you should.
How far back will you go on start the history? Because some programs have made some good practices for the last 3 or 4 years. You can see an increase in our debt potentially.
Yeah. Yeah, typically, the baseline is when you enroll in the program. So the requirement is that you can only get paid for new practices that you implement at or after enrollment. So that's that issue of early adopters. How do early adopters get paid? And unfortunately, they cannot get paid in these market programs. I do think there should be federal policies for that because, well, we don't need to go into that, but the markets will not pay for past activity. Yes, I will say we have been working, so I went to great lengths to talk about insets. Insets are within the supply chains. We are working with the standard setting bodies to account for that, but it might still be a year or 2 or even 3 before we can actually qualify it, because our argument has been, if Danone buys from a producer who has been doing those activities and is a good actor, your greenhouse gas inventory improves their greenhouse gas inventory, because as you pointed out, your soil carbon numbers have been going out. So we have been arguing, if you can account for that, shouldn't Danone be able to capture that, or any other buyer, and include that in their inventory? It actually improves their greenhouse gas inventory. The standard setting bodies have said, actually, yes, that's a very good point. Let's work on the rules for that. So it may be in the future that we can capture that. I warrant that the price signal will not be as high, but there may in fact be a price signal in the future.
So can I, Kent first, and then,
I believe that solar falls under the offset category. Will the grower-owned solar installations be involved in something like this also? It is offset, correct?
It's a good question. So,
solar, just,
yeah.
that's not solar.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so solar is, those are traded in energy markets, basically. But if you look at a whole farm and what a company will pay for, typically, yes, that will qualify and can count. They're just a different market. So like we work in offsets and insets, but not energy, right? But markets do exist for them. They're very highly functioning. There's a lot more liquidity in those energy markets. So yes, solar will count, and you should get paid for it. Not through us, that's correct. We don't work in the energy markets.
Daniel?
Yeah, so different soil types have tremendous different capacities to sequester carbon.
Yep.
How is that taken into account when sampling and monitoring?
It's a good question. So we
The
use,
different
Sorry.
soil types have different capacities to store organic matter, so how is that taken account for in the system?
yeah. So we have a research arm, Ecosystem Service Market Research Consortium, so we've been researching, including on that activity. I will say that we use both measurement and modeling to account for changes in carbon. And the models, to a great extent, do account for that. So we actually figure out where you are, what is the predominant soil type, right, over the fields or orchards that you're working in, and that is accounted for in the models. We do have a research project, interestingly, to look at, is there different capacity for carbon sequestration by soil type? And we have, I don't know, 15 or 20 researchers on the working group, have not been able to come up with a research project in 3 years to do that. And I can't speak to why I don't work on the working groups, but they haven't been able to agree on what a valid research project would be in that area. And I think it's because there's, I don't know, 300,000 soil types, right? So it's a valid question, and I think it does deserve more research.
There's a question over here, somewhere. Yes, you.
It's a good question.
Let me just repeat the question. The question is basically, if you intermittently apply a practice, when does the accounting start for whether you've done it already or not?
It's a good question. Jack asked me that question yesterday. Here's the simple answer, but I don't think it's that simple. Generally, the market will say, if you did it before, then it's not a new practice. But as we know, it is a new practice every time you do it, just like cover crops, right? That's one of the other arguments we're having with the standard setting bodies. It's new every time it happens. So far, they are not buying it, but I think we will make progress in the future. The way it will happen, let's just say it's a new practice for you and you're applying it every year. You actually quantify the credits based on how much you apply per acre. So the models will account for that. And you can change it over time. That is entirely up to you. And we assume you'll see a different signal depending on how much you apply. But you can change it over time.
So guys, we are slightly over time. I apologize. Great to see all the questions. The speakers will be here. We'll go outside of the room. I know from experience, if you want to ask questions, let's meet outside of the room. And before you leave, just a reminder that the next set of presentations will start at 10 a.m. We have stockpile management, which is now in the other room in B10. How your trees work under adequate water supply and deficit is in room B4. Superpowering almonds, global future in B7. And getting the skinny on ABC skin health is in B10. Get a cup of coffee, sponsored by AC Horn. And then just stop by the Almond Board booth to pick up the research update and all the materials. Since I also have my heart in the research side, stop by the poster sessions that are this afternoon and tomorrow afternoon, but they're out there in general. And in general, have a good Almond conference. And thank you, Chris, on the phone. Thank you, Debbie and Jack.
Yeah, bye, Chris.